Support! Give us a subscribe. 300 subs by September 30th. I don't think that's too much to ask. Do you? Warning! Today's topic might be controversial. It might trigger you because I'm going to be talking about whether you really want to play 5th edition or not. So if you don't want to hear me badmouth 5th edition, or if that is an idea that might upset you, stop watching now. I'm also probably going to complain about Critical Role because we know I hate Critical Role. So if that's something that's going to trigger you, stop watching now. Hello and welcome to day 27 of RPG A Day 2020. Once again, thank you very much to the people who created this wonderful creative project and to every one of you who are taking a part of it this year. And if you haven't taken part of it yet, you still have a chance. Go over to Facebook, check out RPG A Day 2020, and contribute to this wonderful free exploration of our hobby. Today's word is favor. Favor. And I thought this one through my head during my walk this morning about what is the one favor I could ask of each and every one of you and of myself in the current RPG political climate. And the one favor I would ask that you do yourself and each and every person who's viewing this do themselves, do yourself a favor and ask yourself, is 5th edition D&D the game you really want to play? Now, caveat, on paper, D&D Next and 5th edition D&D, at least for the first few days before they ruined it, was close to perfect. It was close to what I really thought D&D could be. It was definitely better than 4th. Maybe not as good as 2nd and 3rd, but 5th edition has a different audience. Much like 4th edition's audience was players of World of Warcraft and Magic the Gathering, 5th edition's audience is players of Magic the Gathering and fans of such internet phenomenons like Critical Role. It was not geared towards me, which I completely understand. I am not the target market for 5th edition. The target market of 5th edition is the YouTube internet generation. Fine. Since I originally play-tested D&D Next in its 1st and 2nd and 3rd incarnation, and started playing 5th edition when it first came out, 5 years ago, I have run at least a dozen short burst mini campaigns of D&D, none of them lasting pretty much longer than 5-6 episodes, as compared to Pathfinder and 4th edition, where I ran campaigns that lasted for 2-3 years. Since 5th edition came out, I have probably played in a dozen 5th edition games, none of them lasting very long, compared to previous editions where I was in campaigns that lasted months, years, or in one case, TJ Storm's Company of the Bull campaign, which lasted on and off for 15 years straight. So, do yourself a favor. Is 5th edition the game you really want to play? Because here is my thought. I have played in a dozen 5th edition campaigns. Not one of them was an actual 5th edition campaign. Most of them were hodgepodge homebrews of 5th edition. People tossed rules out, added rules, made their own worlds. I have yet to play in a campaign set in the Forgotten Realms. Every campaign I played in has been in a weird homebrew world with homebrew rules. 5th edition stuff either just said, I'm not going to allow that or whatever. I have yet to play in a game that even allows everything in the player's handbook set in the Forgotten Realms, much less including the splat books, which, I'm against some of the splat books, but others of the splat books are perfectly fine, and I perfectly love them. I would love to play through Tomb of Annihilation. For me, that is the perfect 5th edition game. I would love to play through Storm King's Thunder. Again, perfect 5th edition, perfect adventure. Perfect. I would love to play through the 5th edition version of White Plume Mountain. Favorite module, 5th edition version, genius. Tales from the Yawning Portal, genius. The Waterdeep Dragon thing, the 1st through 5th adventure, the city-based Waterdeep adventure, Dragon Heist, brilliant. Brilliant adventure. Quite possibly the best thing they're ever going to write for 5e, with the exception of maybe Tomb of Annihilation. But Tomb of Annihilation is a very specific audience. That said, every D&D game I have played in has not been 5th edition D&D. It has been some bastard version of 5th edition. I have yet to play 5th edition, which makes me think no DM that I've met really wants to run 5th edition, or they don't really appreciate the 5th edition as it is written. They have a mindset that it should be something different, and they change it to fit that, at which point it stops being 5th edition, which is fine. But do you really want to run 5th edition? Or do yourself a favor and take a look at the other games that are out there right now that might do what you want to do better than 5th edition? Now let's look at it from the other point of view. Me as a DM, I've run maybe a dozen short burst D&D games. I've tried to keep them as close to as at least the player's handbook as possible. There has been a few things where I've just been like, no, you can't play that. But for the most part, I have been generally like, look, I'm running a game at a game store. I'm trying to make this game store money. I'm trying to run D&D as it's written to teach people how to play D&D. I'm not going to homebrew a lot of stuff. I'm going to try and keep it as close to the books as well as I understand it. I'm going to set most of my campaigns in the Forgotten Realms or in a generic enough world that the players can create as they go along. But since my goal was to make a game store money and I was running at a game store, I tried to run 5th edition as written. I ran probably a dozen games. Very few of them lasted more than 5 sessions because without a doubt, almost every player that has sat at my table did not want to play 5th edition as written. They find it boring. They find it sluggish. They find that it doesn't let them do the things they want to do in their brains or build the characters they want to build in their brains. And most of all, they are extremely disappointed that 5th edition as written, 5th edition as played, whether it be at my game or other games, is not Critical Role. So many of them come to the table expecting it to be just like Critical Role, and really it's more, my games are more like Acquisitions Incorporated than Critical Role, and nobody is running a game like Critical Role except for Matt Mercer. So having that expectation that, oh, they're going to sit down at the table and they want a game just like Critical Role, and then it's not like Critical Role, part of the reason why so many of my games have fallen apart. It doesn't live up to the expectation. It's D&D in their brain and D&D on paper are two completely different beasts. And when the D&D in their brain doesn't meet the D&D on paper, D&D on paper is still pretty much the same game it's always been, a very sluggish, I go, then you go, then that person goes, this spell can very do much, war game with some role-playing. But really, it's still basically just a war game, a go through the dungeon, kill monsters, take their stuff, miniature war game. The role-playing has only added if the people all at the table agree to just say, fuck this, and we're just going to role-play and might use these rules. But then that's not 5th edition, which is fine. 5th edition as written is fine. It is the meat and potatoes, macaroni and cheese of role-playing. Are there better games? Absolutely. Are there games that do D&D better than D&D? Absolutely. How many awards did D&D win this year at Gamma and the Ennies and at the other contests? 1 for art? So do yourself a favor, player. Is D&D the game you want to play? Because chances are, it really isn't. You don't really want to play D&D. You want to play something else that lets you do all the things in your head and play the way you think they're playing on Critical Role. And they're not playing D&D and Critical Role. It's set in Matt Mercer's own world. It's got a bunch of Matt Mercer's own homebrews, and every one of those people are professional actors. So when you see them playing at the level they're playing, that's because not only have they played together for years, but they're all professional trained actors who do that for a living. As Mercer once said, If you want to compare your game to my game and you want to bring it like Sam, as Sam Riegel, then you better bring it like Sam, because just look at the way he plays when he really brings it. Otherwise, just play your game and stop comparing yourself to me. And the final favor I would say is DMs, don't allow your players to watch Critical Role. And you probably shouldn't watch Critical Role. If you're watching it now, stop. You're not doing yourself a favor, because all you're doing is establishing these expectations that you're going to run like Matt Mercer, they're going to play, and you're going to play like the guys at Matt Mercer's table, and it's just fucking not going to happen. Do yourself a favor. Ask yourself, is 5th edition really the system I want to run? Because if you want to run 5th edition, you have to run it as written. Otherwise, it's not 5th edition. It's another game you're running. And at that point, you should just not run 5th edition and run the game that does what you want to do. Because that game exists. I assure you, there are hundreds of fantasy role-playing games out right now that are as good or better than 5th edition, that do what 5th edition does much better. And you can probably find the game that is going to create the world you want to run without you having to take apart 5th edition and fix it. Because otherwise, run 5th edition as it's written, set in the Forgotten Realms. Ask yourself, players, do yourself a favor. Is 5th edition the game you want to play? Because so far, no game I've run with none of the players I have played with, including the one I am currently running now, do they actually want to play 5th edition. I don't know what they want to play, but 5th edition is a boring slog fest with very, it's 5th edition, it's D&D, and D&D is written a certain way. And they have these images in their mind that it's going to be like the video game, and it's going to be like what they saw on the internet. It's going to be like what they saw on TV. And that's not. And I'm not a good enough DM to make that. And I don't know any DM that is, except for maybe Mercer. And even Mercer is questionable because it's a TV show. I'm more like Perkins. Do yourself a favor. Don't compare yourself to Critical Role. Don't let your players watch Critical Role. Don't watch Critical Role. Do yourself a favor. Ask yourself, is D&D the game you really want to run? Do yourself a favor. Ask yourself, is D&D really the game you want to play? Read the rules. Really read the rules. Really understand how the system works and what the system will and will not let you do. And understand this is not a role-playing centric game. So do yourself a favor before you decide to invest hundreds of dollars in Dungeons & Dragons product. Is that the game you really want to play? That said, come on down to Seth's Games and Anime, where I'm running D&D every week and have been for the past 15 years. Support me!